Perfect. Thank you for being with us through the entire day and for continuing to be here with us. We now have a panel to continue on with the conversation that just happened with the president called Present and Future, Mitigating the Fallout of the Multi-Crisis on Populations While Building Long-Term Solutions. So, I want to directly get to our speakers and introduce them. We have Gilbert Hongbo, the Director General of the Organisation Internationale du Travail. We have Dr. Mohamed Al-Jasser, the Président de la Banque Islamique de Développement, the President of the IDB. We have Rémi Roux, the Director General of the Agence France de Développement. And we have Daniela Schwarzer, the Director Executive of the Open Society Foundations. Thank you all. So, to set the context, Dr. Jasser, a lot has been spoken about when we're getting right to it. A lot has been spoken about the multi-crisis. Could you, from your perspective, tell me how you define the multi-crisis? And when I say your perspective, obviously, the Islamic Development Bank, how do you all define this multi-crisis? What are the various facets to it as you see it?
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and I'm very happy to be with this group. Well, crises, usually we're used to having them one at a time. This time we're having a multitude of crises. As they say, when it rains, it pours, I guess. We started with the COVID and all of the impact it had on the populations, including on the supply chain, logistics, medications, all of that. That was a very serious disruption to to lives and livelihoods. And then after that, immediately, the manifestations of climate change were becoming more serious and more impactful, affecting lives and livelihoods on the farms, but also in the urban areas because of costs of food. So we have that added, we haven't even recovered from the COVID, and we're already hit with this one. And then the third one hit, which is the war in the Ukraine and the spike in food prices that had happened. That I called it the vicious trinity that has impacted our world. There are other crises that are tangential to that. I mean, when prices started going up, inflation rising, and then interest rates started rising to cope with the problems that we're having. Well, that we can find the roots of that in the recovery of in the crisis of 2008, when interest rates were lowered significantly, and all of the quantitative easing that happened, which raised the prices of assets, and therefore accentuating or exacerbating the inequalities that were in existence globally and within each country. So when you take all of that and put them together, we really have a very serious multilateral international issue that only a multilateral solution can really address. It's not a one-country issue. It's not a one-commodity issue. It is a multitude of issues hitting us at the same time.
Thank you. Daniela, Dr. Jasser has very nicely set a context for us. We are in Paris. Can you tell me what do these times mean for the European Union, and specifically also what is the responsibility of the European Union in response to the crisis that we're facing right now?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I fully agree with the assessment that you have just given. This multitude of crises, if you ask me for the EU situation, this is obviously something that is very much felt in the European Union as well. However, the political attention was at the beginning of this year, when Russia started its war in Ukraine, mostly focused on that, because it fundamentally shattered the European security order. A country came under attack. and with it the violation of international norms. So the significance of this war goes well beyond Europe and well beyond Ukraine. An attack of an autocracy or even a country developing towards a kind of dictatorship on a democratic country. All this has a huge political significance. But what surfaced over the past month is that Europe realized that it needs to invest much more on the global questions that have just been mentioned, while the political attention was very much, first of all, inward-looking, to be able to support Ukraine to the extent that we need to support Ukraine, but that at the same time, the international engagement of the European Union needs to be strengthened. And so what we see at the moment is, yes, a revival of transatlantic relations, for instance, the US having returned as a hugely important actor. Insecurity was always there, but right now the significance is clearly seen from a European perspective. But what we really need to look at is the global agenda. And here we have to be very honest with ourselves. Has Europe done enough, for instance, for vaccine distribution since the COVID crisis hit, which was mentioned as one of the big crises? No, it hasn't. Has it done early and enough to stop the trend that we are currently seeing, namely that poverty is actually not reducing as is a global goal, but is coming back more strongly? No, Europe has waited. Now, the issue of climate change as well, the European engagement for a global climacy policy, the support for the global south and managing climate transition, all this needs to move further up on the agenda. And I think at the moment we are in a phase where this is being realized, where first steps are being taken. And we also see that the conversation between Europe and the global south, between the US and the global south, that this has heated up. And so those issues are on the table, and it is the moment to find global and joint action to be able to tackle them. So we must be more inventive, we must be more engaged. Again, we are worrying about the question, can we bring up enough money and support for Ukraine? But the actual question also has to be, do we do enough to invest collectively on global recovery, on breaking the trend towards more divergence between the global north and the global south? And here I think Europe still has its job to do.
You've given me a good segue to come to you, Mr. Gilbert. We heard earlier today during the opening speech where Queen Rania said different refugees are treated differently, not because of budgetary concerns, but because of bigotry and bias based on people's skin color. So could you do us a favor and talk more about inequality and what that looks like when you talk about access to social justice, right? Access being a key word.
No, first of all, thank you for having us here. I believe it's a very good segue. What we have been seeing from the multi-crisis dimension that the president of ASDB described to what you say in terms of the response that we have heard from European perspective, but quite frankly, let's say from even a global perspective, lead me to bring back I think is the US President Franklin Roosevelt, who says that the progress we should be looking for is not how much we add to our collective wealth, but how much do we provide to the have-nots. And what we have seen so far is while the global wealth is increasing, and I found that fascinating. A few weeks ago, you might recall, we have this big deal on Twitter, 44 billion. And at the same time, I was listening to the detail on that, and I get this report from ILO Monitor, who indicates that although at the very beginning of the year, the current year, the world starts recovering from COVID-19 in terms of number of hours worked, but the third quarter, 2022, for the first time, the number of hours worked went back below the 2019 level by 1.5%, which is equivalent of 40 million jobs. So it tells you that how the world seems to go in kind of two different paths. And increasingly, even the recovery that I was referring to, when you start unpacking it, the recovery is very pronounced on global north. I mean, the global south is really able. The other side that what we have noticed is that recovery is happening more on the informal sector than the formal sector. 95% of it is in the informal sector. More women are quitting the job market. Although globally we can say that there is a recovery, when you start unpacking it, the inequality dimension, and that is not, it goes beyond what we are normally used to. It's not about also between white collar and blue collar. So, quite frankly, it is the time, if you want to look at that, the glass half full, is a time for us together, that's what I want to insist on, to really have some kind of a coalition for us to address those inequalities. Inequalities and from a big, major societal dimensions, inequality from gender dimension, inequality from fighting against discrimination for people of African descent, fight discrimination from groups like LGBTI, inequalities that we're seeing from the low-skilled job perspective, different type of groups that are facing inequality, discrimination. We need to zero in that it's not sufficient anymore for us to just limit ourselves to the global by saying that the world is progressing. The social justice, global social justice, has to be at the center of all policy making at the national level, regional level, and international level.
Thank you. Remy, you are just joining us from COP. Have you had, and you've been going there, I'm guessing, for very many years. Have you had any specific reflections that you would like to share with us here? Any reason for hope or to be worried more?
Sure. If possible, if you allow me,
oui, bien sûr.
Since we are in Paris, I will speak in French. Oui, je reviens de Sharm el-Sheikh.
Just back from Sharm el-Sheikh.
Donc évidemment une enceinte dédiée
forum
à la
that is
discussion sur
completely devoted to the discussion on how to fight climate change. What struck me was
cette addition de crises
that there's an accumulation of crises, and that was very much the focus of the discussions in COP27, probably much more than in previous editions of COP. Of course, climate crisis, but also the crisis for biodiversity. It's now an environmental constellation that's seen as a whole. The dimension, the social dimension, obviously, as Gilbert has just said, macroeconomic disorders of great concern, and geopolitical issues that we may at some point have thought were a thing of the past. But the tensions are still there. They may have changed a bit, tensions between North and South. President Biden is at COP today.
Aussi les États-Unis avec cette question quand même.
There were high expectations of the United States. The United States are very present in Ukraine. Are they very present in international cooperation when it comes to fighting climate change?
Vous savez, le rapport du GIEC de l'IPCC.
Not always easy to understand the US position, and the IPCC reports help us understand the magnitude of the climate change. We can't say that fighting poverty is in competition with fighting climate change, because if you look at the poverty map and the climate change consequent map, you'll see that they overlap. Those areas of the world that are most disproportionately hit by climate change are also the areas of the world that are most poor. And I think that we're beginning to realize there's a convergence of the agendas of the decision is being prepared, and which will be presented more clearly next week. But I think the principle is now accepted since Sunday, and that is that we need to put loss and damage into COP discussions. And in the meeting rooms, in the corridors, it was immediately clear that this opens up a space, an acceptance of climate justice, social justice, even sort of the legacy of colonialism. And last comment on COP,
Ce que j'ai trouvé intéressant dans cette
course,
première
there are
semaine,
tensions,
c'est
but
qu'il y a aussi
during the
beaucoup de
first
discussions sur les
week, I
solutions.
noted there are lots of
vous savez,
discussions about
ce qu'on appelle
solutions. It's very
Just Energy
solution-focused.
Transition Partnership
The Just
est en
Energy
train de se
Transition
construire
Partnership
d'abord en Afrique du Sud, mais
is
aussi,
emerging in
au Vietnam,
South
en
Africa,
Indonésie,
in
en
Vietnam,
Inde,
in
au Sénégal.
Indonesia, in India, in
Tout le monde en
Senegal.
parlait, hein, et il
There's
s'agit
been a
bien
lot of talk
d'un
about this,
cadre dans
and this
lequel
is really
on
a
ferme
framework
des centrales à charbon, bien sûr, on
which
ferme des
means that you
mines,
can close down
mais on le fait
coal-fired
bien
power
sûr
plants and mines,
en intégrant la
as you need
justice
to do,
sociale, en
but taking
intégrant la
on board
formation
social
professionnelle, en
justice,
intégrant le travail décent,
retraining
évidemment,
for the
tout l'agenda
workers,
que
decent
Gilbert Humboldt
jobs.
et l'OIT portent aussi haut,
The
et qu'il faut
agenda
évidemment
that's
rapprocher
defended
des
by the ILO and Gilbert
climatiques.
Humboldt
Donc
here. So
ne
all
nous
of these
arrêtons pas
dimensions
peut-être aux
being
tensions,
integrated
cherchons
into a
les
climate
solutions. On
discussion.
parlait
So
beaucoup aussi
there are
d'assurance
tensions, but let's look at the
climatique, on parlait
solutions.
beaucoup de
Insurance,
systèmes
climate
d'alerte
insurance,
précoce,
early
donc,
warning
pour permettre de faire
systems.
face
All
et
of
de
this is being
s'adapter évidemment
discussed
au
so that we
réchauffement
can cope and
inévitable
adapt
de
to
la
the
température du
inevitable
globe.
warming of our
Merci,
planet.
Rémi.
Thank you, Rémi.
Dr. Jasser, it's not lost on me that you're the president of the Islamic Development Bank. So I think we must talk about mandates and solutions to get to a place of development. You brought up the crisis of 2008. Has there been any of the learnings that have been taken from the crisis that we've seen then that gives you an assurance that we will be able to get out of this crisis? Can you highlight any concrete steps that any countries have undertaken, any mandates that you actually find hope in, that you want us to double down on?
Well, the problem with the 2008 crisis was that it was centered in the advanced countries' financial sector through the over-leveraging that happened. So a lot of the developing countries were just on the receiving end. And the members, the 57 member countries of the Islamic Development Bank, are all developing countries. But nonetheless, these crises that we are trying to deal with now are of a little bit of a different nature, in the sense that you have to address them on the micro level and you have to address them in the macro level. On the micro level, we at the Islamic Development Bank have immediately after the COVID crisis, we have put together a response package of $4.5 billion, quick dispersing, available for the membership to really acquire those vaccines and medical equipment that they need to address the issues. With the food crisis now, we have also just adopted, last July, we have adopted a food crisis response program package of $10.5 billion. And actually, only a few weeks ago, I was in Jordan, signed the first one, the first agreement for $200 million, because as you know, Jordan has 40% of its population are refugees. Mm-hmm. So really the impact on them is very, very serious. So, but there are 10 other Arab development institutions, the Arab Coordination Group, all of them are working on that. And then we have 12 other multilateral international institutions. And the challenge is bigger than all of us also. And therefore, I go back to the multilateral approach that is needed. Some of the problems had arisen because we neglected multilateralism, because we were trying to do everything bilaterally. Well, now we know it's the problem, the size of the problems is too big for any one country or two countries to deal with. We need a very sound, well-articulated, multilateral international approach to deal with these problems. And actually, the 2008 crisis, one of the good things about it, if any crisis has anything good about it, is that the world really acted immediately and quickly. And partly because the G20 had been created 10 years earlier, and a lot of people were saying, why did we have the G20? It was useless, just a lot of meetings. Well, when the crisis of 2007, 2008 hit, the G20 was ready to address these issues, and immediately people could call each other on first-name basis, the ministers of finance and the central bank governors from the US to the other European and other developing country members of the G20. So there is a precedent. We should probably learn from it, and I hope that we will not neglect that, because a lot of these countries that are suffering now are in really, really dire straits, and they need all the help we can provide them.
Thank you. Daniela, you brought up that Europe could do more. You brought up some of the responsibilities of Europe. I think if we're having an honest conversation, we must talk about that it is also the crisis of failed leadership that we see across, many places where they want to double down on xenophobia, on, not to strengthen multilateralism. So as someone who is representing Open Society foundations, and we're talking about more and more doubling down on closing of borders, what is the work that Open Society Foundation is doing right now to protect civil space and also just, really double down on what multilateralism means?
Well, thank you for that question. Most of our work is really exactly about that. So we are an organization that works worldwide, so you will find different answers in different regions. But there's one trend which we of course observe globally, and that is the rise of authoritarianism and a shrinking number of democracies. And yet there are democratic successes. Take the election in Brazil recently, or take the positive news from the United States. So it's not a lost cause at all. But it requires not only investment to maintain, but really also to innovate. So what we do is we work with civil society organizations that want to bring new ideas, to bring equity, to bring participation, to bring different ways of actually challenging those authoritarian trends. And if I just look back at the past 2-3 years, what we saw, for instance, with the COVID crisis, we saw that some democratically elected governments actually used this moment of a health crisis to strengthen their grip. It was the moment of the executive, and some governments, even in the European Union, used it as a momentum to clamp down on civil liberties, at least temporarily, and to strengthen their own role in their domestic policy arena. And so I think what we do is we continue to work with civil society. We articulate clearly on a policy level what we think must happen, and that sometimes is very local or national, but sometimes it's also multilateral. And so Open Society works with organizations that have a strong knowledge and interest and say when we speak about the future of multilateralism. And I think in the conversation here it became obvious that we need to think further in the way we structure multilateral relations and innovate organizations. Currently, what we see is that the old system and the old structures are being challenged from within. There are alternative regional arrangements growing. We see a growing Chinese influence. That is definitely not a country working for the norms we support as Open Society. But the question is, how can we build that dialogue that we need on how we govern the global problems that we actually have to govern? They were all mentioned on the stage. And this also means, to give you a very practical example, for instance, from a European Union perspective, how does the EU structure its relationships with other regional entities? The African Union comes to mind. How does the G20 do that? Could we integrate the African Union more closely with the G20? All those are questions which are on the table for a long time, but they need to be answered and need to be implemented. So I think there's a lot to do, and we, as an organization that is both a funder but also tries to be a change maker as much as we can, we try to bridge the local, the national, the regional, and then the global level by working this way.
Thank you. Gilbert, maybe I can ask you. Daniela raised a lot of how questions. You spoke about coalitions. There's often money and budgets to be found when you talk about national security reasons, but not enough when we talk about social justice, racism, LGBTQI issues. So yes, everyone will say, okay, I'm here, we can build a coalition. But constructively, what does that look like? When you speak about we need a coalition, what does that mean? Where specifically, if you had 3 priority areas you could highlight where money needs to go right away, where would that be?
First of all, clearly social protection, and the social protection itself starting with universal health care. Secondly, I'll talk about the protection of workers' rights and ensuring that there is a minimum living income for every household. And that we know today that the labor income is 70% of the household income. And therefore, looking at that in the current crisis and beyond the current crisis, ensuring that, I really believe that it is unacceptable that a humankind will spend 40, 50 hours working a week, yet not being able to pay its bill at the end of the month or the family bills. So how do we ensure that we need to put money in changing the policy at the national and international level to ensure that we can provide to every household a minimum living income? What we are planning to do, and we are planning to make sure that every 2-3 years, we produce a global report on the state of social justice in the world at the global level and how that gets unpacked at the regional and national level, and invite every country to look at the photography of its situation and zoom in where need to be improved. And we, from the multilateral that you mentioned very well, we have to ensure that we can also account for how our work on a daily basis contributes to improving the social justice around the world.
Merci. Donc, Remy,
Remy,
what do you think could be the role of public banks if you take a step away from your specific role as AFD, but the role of public banks, and specifically also, given France wants to, is very serious and sincere about being a leader when it comes to addressing this crisis, what are the leadership roles that you are witnessing that you find we can really address this crisis through these specific steps that AFD is undertaking?
Bon, on ne peut pas s'arrêter à constater les crises.
We can't simply note that there are
Il
crises.
faut agir, évidemment.
We have to take action.
Et il faut trouver des
And we
alliés
have to find allies
partout dans le monde, des alliés
all over the
évidemment,
world.
Dans la société civile, dans le
In
secteur
civil
privé, mais
society
aussi
and in the private
dans le
sector,
secteur public.
as well as in the public sector.
Les cours de justice, évidemment,
Courts of justice
ont leur propre mouvement, et on voie bien sur les
have their own
questions
movements.
sociales, sur les questions environnementales aussi qu'elles
They work on
même
social
si parfois les
questions, on
gouvernements
environmental
sont
questions,
bloqués,
even at times when
continuent
governments are
d'avancer
making no headway.
par leur
Sometimes the
jurisprudence.
courts do.
D'une autre façon, oui,
case law.
les banques publiques de développement, je
And
pense,
public
sont
development
une
banks
force
as well, I believe, are a strength.
positive pour faire
for
face à
good.
cette conjonction de crises. Donc,
face
Mohamed
these
et moi,
crises.
sur ce panel,
Mohamed
on
and myself,
représente un peu ce
We
monde
represent that aspect.
dont on est en train, je crois, comme à chaque fois qu'il y a une très grande crise, en
And
fait, de
like with all major crises,
reprendre la mesure et de
we are starting
remobiliser.
to
Parce que
take
nous
stock.
avons toujours été créés pour ça, en fait.
This is what we were
Des
created for,
institutions
after all.
qui essayent d'articuler
We
le
are
long terme et le court
institutions
terme,
trying to work
qui
both at
essayent
the long term
d'articuler
and on the
le
short term,
public et le privé, qui
bring together
ça a
public
toujours été les
and
banques publiques
private
de développement.
forces.
Elles sont
That's always
d'ailleurs
been the
nées
case
toujours dans des
of
temps de
public
crise,
development banks that have
Juste un
always
exemple,
come into
souvenez-vous, on a
being in
créé la
times of
Banque mondiale
crisis.
à Bretton
The World
Woods.
Bank was created in Bretton
On
Woods
était tous bankrupt. Il y avait plus
when
personne
everybody
n'avait
was
d'argent.
bankrupt. Everybody
Donc,
was out of
on a
money.
trouvé quand même, alors on a inventé une notion
So
incroyable
we
qui s'appelle
invented
le
an unbelievable
callable
notion,
capital,
which is
c'est-à-dire qu'on a dit
callable
qu'on avait
capital.
on a fait comme si on avait du capital.
So we just pretended
moment
that
même
we
où on en
had
avait pas,
capital at a time when we
La Caisse des
didn't
dépôts et
actually have
des
any.
consignations en France, qui est la plus vieille banque publique de développement.
The oldest
elle est née
development
quand
bank
notre
in
pays
France
était
was
par terre
born
aussi.
when
Donc, faut
our
pas
country
croire
was
que parce
also
que
in
ça va mal,
shambles.
on n'a pas de
So,
capacité d'action.
It's actually when things are going very badly that
Et je pense qu'il
we
va
start
se
to
passer
innovate.
dans ce monde-là quelque chose. Prenez juste
I
la
think
mesure. On a fait la
we're already
recherche.
taking
il y a
stock. We've
plus de-
carried
il y a
out
520
research.
banques
There are
publiques de
over
développement dans le monde.
520 public
Ça fait
development banks
aujourd'hui
around the
2500
world.
milliards de
2005,
dollars d'investissement chaque année.
2.5
Bon, si tous
trillion
ces-
in investment every year.
Ces 2500 milliards devenaient verts, devenaient
So if this 2.5 trillion became green or more socially inclusive, and of course all of these institutions,
Donc je ne parle pas que des banques multilatérales,
not just
je parle
multilateral
aussi
banks,
des
but
banques
also
sous-régionales, je parle des banques
sub-regional
nationales,
banks,
je
national
pense
banks,
des banques dans les États fédérés, au Brésil
in
par
federated
exemple, ou ailleurs.
states such
Il y en
as
a
Brazil
partout.
and
Et
elsewhere.
la bonne nouvelle que je voulais vous apporter, c'est
And the
que
good news I wanted to
ces
bring to you is
institutions
that
travaillent,
these
de plus en
institutions
plus
are working
collectivement.
more and more.
C'est vraiment un monde de
Together.
coopération. Moi, j'ai
It's
jamais
a world of
rencontré
cooperation.
le président d'une autre banque publique
I've
avec
never
lequel je ne
met
sois pas d'accord.
the chairman of another public bank that I don't agree with. I've been chairing
Donc, il y a le
the
groupe des
AFD
banques
for
multilatérales,
6
bien
years,
sûr.
and that's been the case throughout.
Il y a l'IDFC, qui est le
There's the
club
World
de
Bank, there's
27
the
que je préside. Et
IDFC,
puis
that's the
maintenant,
Club
et
of
je
27
remercie
that
le
I'm
Forum de
chairing.
Paris parce que c'est
And thanks
né
to the
dans
Paris
le
Peace
Forum de
Forum, because
Paris
this
en
is where it
2020.
was born in
On a ce mouvement qui
2020.
s'appelle FIX,
It's a
Finance in
movement
Common
called
Summit,
Finance in
qui
Common.
en est à sa 3e édition. On
And
s'est
we've had
réunis
our
à
third
Abidjan
summit.
il y a
We
3
met in
semaines
Abidjan
maintenant.
3 weeks ago.
1000 participants. Enfin, il y a
1,000
quelque chose voilà, que
participants.
je vous prie de prêter attention à parce
And
que
this
c'est
is something you
nouveau,
really
c'est
should be
positif,
paying
c'est
attention
puissant, je
to.
crois.
It's new
Et
and it's
peut-être
powerful and it's positive.
émergera de ce groupe et
And maybe
de son dialogue avec les autres parties prenantes
in this group and in its dialogue with
un
other
nouveau cadre
stakeholders,
qui me paraît
perhaps we
absolument
can
indispensable.
create a new
Parce que
framework,
il faut effectivement de la
which
finance.
is direly
On
needed.
l'entend partout, mais il faut sans doute un
We
nouveau
need
type de
finance,
finance.
but we also need a
Il faut
new
qu'on
type of
dépasse le
finance.
vieux
We have to go
clivage
beyond
entre la finance du
the old
développement,
split between
l'aide
development
publique au développement,
finance,
et puis la finance climat.
public development
Et il faut
assistance,
qu'on
and then
redéfinisse un
climate
cadre et des incitations
finance.
pour faire deux choses.
We have to
Évidemment,
motivate people
financer
to
ce que
do
personne
two
ne
things.
finance.
People
Donc,
to
encore une
fund
fois,
what's not being funded
les
right
régions
now,
du monde les plus fortement frappées,
those who
les
are
secteurs
struck
où il n'y a
hardest
pas
by
de
climate change, the
possibilité à
sectors
court
where they
terme de
have
création
no
de valeur.
short-term
Donc ça, c'est
possibility
vraiment
to
un peu
create values.
l'humanitaire,
So this is
l'adaptation,
humanitarian. It has
le
to
loss
do
and
with
damage. Enfin, il y a tout un
adaptation,
paquet de sujets
loss
là,
and
sur lesquels il
damage.
faut
These are all
recréer
topics
de la
that,
confiance
well,
entre
we
le
have
Nord
to
et le
foster
Sud.
trust
Et puis,
between the global North and the global South.
il faut absolument mettre une partie de nos ressources
And we
publiques
also have to
pour
set aside public
financer les
funds
SDGs,
to
en fait, pour
fund
financer
the
le climat,
SDGs
pour faire levier, pour mobiliser le secteur
for the
privé.
climate.
Et
We need to call
aujourd'hui,
upon the
tout ça
private
est
sector.
très peu clair.
And none of this
Et
is
il faut
very clear
absolument
right now.
qu'on redéfinisse
We
tout ça. Donc ça
absolutely
aussi,
have to
c'était présent
redefine
un
all
peu
of
dans les
this.
discussions
And this
à la
was
COP27. Je
mentioned
pense que c'est
at
présent un peu dans toutes les
COP27,
enceintes.
and I think
Il
it
va
also is
falloir
also
qu'on
being
trouve un
talked about in
endroit
other
pour
fora. But we do need to
arriver à
find a
cette
place
redéfinition. Je pense
where
qu'on
we
n'en est
can
pas.
redefine
Je
all
pense
of
qu'on n'en est
this.
pas très loin, que tout ce
I
travail
think
a
we're
commencé.
getting
Vous
there.
avez
I
peut-être
think
suivi,
all of this work is starting to bear
le
fruit.
président Macron, la première
President
ministre
Macron,
des
the
Barbades,
Prime
William
Minister of
Motley,
Barbados,
cette
William
Bridgetown
Motley,
Initiative, la secrétaire au Trésor américaine, Janet Yellen, lors des
Janet
assemblées
Yellen
annuelles du
of
Fonds
the
monétaire
US
et de la Banque.
Treasury,
Beaucoup de leaders
the IMF.
politiques
Many
appellent
political leaders are
à ce
calling
renouvellement de
for
l'architecture
this renewal
financière
of the
internationale.
international
Ça doit
financial
sortir de cette crise,
architecture.
je pense. On ne peut pas rester avec
We
le
cannot
décalage
stay in
qu'on a
this
aujourd'hui,
crisis.
avec l'espoir évidemment que cette reformulation
hope that
de ce cadre
With an
financier
overhauling
international
of the international
puisse
financial
convaincre
framework
nos concitoyens de telle
would be a
sorte
way of
que plus
convincing
de
our
moyens,
fellow
parce qu'il en faut
citizens
plus de moyens
to
soient
provide
mis dans
more
la
means
coopération et dans l'action
for
internationale.
cooperation
Je pense
and
que l'ancien cadre
international
a
actions.
montré ses limites.
I think that
Il
the
est
old
même,
framework
l'aide publique au
has
développement,
shown that it's
les
limited. Even
bénéficiaires de l'aide
official
publique au
development
développement
assistance
rejettent même aujourd'hui ce cadre. Donc c'est grave quand même.
is refusing this
Donc, et la
framework.
finance climat, c'est quelque chose qui n'est pas clair.
And climate finance
Encore.
is something
Même
that's
si
still
la force
quite
politique, je
blurry,
pense, est plutôt aujourd'hui de
even
ce
though there
côté.
is political
Donc,
willingness.
il faut aller dans ce sens et je pense que
We do have to go
encore une
further
fois,
in this
Paris,
direction.
le forum de
In
Paris,
Paris, and the Paris
c'est
Peace
sa thèse en
Forum
fait, d'être un
is,
lieu où des
well,
nouvelles
this is what it
formes
was created for,
d'action
to be a
collective de
new way of
multilatéralisme
taking,
naissent et des
of
nouveaux-
creating
des nouveaux
multi-stakeholder
concepts, des
approaches,
nouveaux cadres.
coming up with
Donc,
new
pourquoi
frameworks.
pas ici, dans ce cadre,
So,
progresser dans les prochaines
Perhaps
années
in the coming
vers,
years, we can also
cette
all
contribution du
move
système
together
financier. Et
to
encore une fois, je
creating a
m'arrête
new
pas ici aux
financial
banques
system.
publiques parce que
And not
si on a
just
un cadre,
within
il doit aussi
public
être adopté,
development
concerner
banks.
les banques privées. Enfin,
It also
l'ensemble du
has to
système
be
financier, c'est ça
adopted
qu'on
by
avait mis dans
private
l'accord
banks.
de Paris en 2015 à
And that's what we
l'article
put in the
2.1c.
Paris Agreement
que j'ai eu
in
l'honneur
2015 in
de
paragraph
négocier à
2.1c, which I
Donc voilà,
negotiated.
pardon, je suis un peu...
at the time.
Mais juste donner le sentiment à l'audience que
I just wanted to give the
je crois
public the
vraiment qu'il y a un
feeling
mouvement
that I
qui est
really do
engagé,
believe that
qui est
something
très
is underway,
important,
that
qui est
there
très
is
puissant.
momentum,
Mais on a besoin de l'aide de tous.
but we need everybody
et
on
de lieux
board
comme le Forum de Paris
And we need
sur la
for
place
us,
pour que
such
ça
as
se
this one,
cristallise à un moment.
to bring it into
L'OCDE,
fruition, the
l'UNESCO, la Chambre de
OECD,
commerce
UNESCO,
internationale.
International Chamber of
C'est
Commerce.
ici qu'est né le
That's
cadre de
where
l'aide publique au développement, hein, vous le savez,
ODA was
dans un
born,
comité de l'OCDE. Pourquoi le
within
nouveau
a
cadre
committee
ne
of the
naîtrait pas
OECD.
aussi de nos discussions?
and maybe a new one come into being here.
With that, that, I would like to just say if any of you have any final, we've discussed It is multilateral. There is multiple dimensions to this crisis. But if any of you want to highlight any specific priority points that the work that you're already doing, that you would like the people to know, the stakeholders to know, that you want support on, I will leave it to you all to end it on that note. Yes.
Yes, you asked the question earlier, if you had the money you have and you're going to spend it, what are the priorities? One, agriculture. Now we realize food is too important to be left just to globalization. Countries, especially in the developing world, need their agriculture to be attended to. And that's why the $10.5 billion we have, only 1/3 is going to be for short-term restocking and rebuilding of inventories. The 2/3 are going to be for medium and long-term development of the agricultural sector. We already spent $20 billion, but we're going to spend more because this is, you keep the families on the farm, so they have work. They're not migrating. They are fed. They have food on the table. And then also, they will send some food to the urban areas. So it's a win-win situation. Food is very important. Second, we realize now that electricity is a must. Nothing works, not refrigeration, not lighting for people to study, not the computers, nothing works without electricity. So we need to use the innovations with solar and renewable energy and everything else to really bring electricity to the villages and the rural areas in the developing world. The third one, the internet, we thought it was only for the rich kids. Well, now we know during the COVID, between 500 million and 1 billion kids had no education whatsoever because they had no connectivity. So connectivity is no longer something you just, use to play games or to do something. No, it is a must for e-learning, for e-health, for e-education, for everything. So these three, we're paying more attention, and I'm calling upon everyone here to really also start paying more attention because they're so instrumental. They are the levers of development and helping these countries deal with all of these crises that we started out with.
Perfect. Gilbert, would you have any specific project, initiative that your organization is doing that you just want to draw attention to mobilize more support for?
And I will be quick. I see that we are running late. I just want to echo what you said, particularly on the agriculture side. Yeah, I'm coming from Rome, so I can imagine it's very clear. Particularly, let's keep in mind that Africa today imports 70 billion food products a year. We can turn that into opportunity for job creation and wealth creation. But back to your point, 3 quick points. One is the supply chain. And the supply chain, which we know, engine for job creation, engine for economic growth. At the same token, there's a lot of unhealthy thing going on, namely child labor, forced labor, occupational safety and health, that really push people down. So supply chain is one thing. To complement the internet penetration point that the president of SB was mentioning, I will also put on the table the platform economy. We know today that the direction that our global economy is taking is on the platform economy, so we need to pay much more attention to it, which leads me to my third and last point, all of that to support the job creation for the youth.
Thank you. Daniela, Open Society Foundations has a broad mandate. The one thing that you are particularly enthusiastic about in terms of the impact it can have on the life of citizens or democracy?
Well, I think I spoke already to the aspect of open society and how we work across the world in different regions to foster civil society and civic activism. But I want to pick up one point which, may seem an unusual one, but it actually is of great interest to the Open Society Foundations. And I pick up a point Remy made when he said we need to bring together the discussion on development aid, the reform of the international financial system. And I would add, let's listen to how civil society can actually chime into that debate. I just want to give you 2 examples where you see that the discussion about financial support and civil society should be going hand in hand. One is Ukraine. Right now, you know, it's the time where obviously the war is still ongoing, and it seems very far away to speak about reconstruction and recovery. And yet, the preparations are starting. If you look at the country, it becomes obvious that if you don't get a very intensive buy-in by civil society on the ground, not only in implementation and rebuilding and making sure recovery happens, but also now in the planning phase, also where you need some scrutiny on what the government does, although it's a war situation. It's very clear that here the two have to go hand in hand, because it's an enormous effort, and it has to be a legitimate one for within the country and for the donors. So the fight against corruption needs to go on. You need to put systems in place that the money is well used, and so on. So here's one example. The other one is, and we are engaging on that issue more and more, is the question of how the international financial institutions should be reformed. Obviously, a discussion which has been around for years or even decades, that we need to rethink them and we need to open them. There needs to be more equity, more inclusion. But right now, as Remy has said, we have such a accumulation of different crises where no international financial institution alone can make a difference, no single government, and both of them not without civil society, which is one of the reasons why we engage in those discussions. And we look at it from really the question of open society, societal resilience, in some cases open and stability of democracies. But what is very clear is that you see that countries which are under severe debt distress, there you see the social tensions within growing. There is a real risk of political instability and potentially violence. So those questions are more and more of interest to us, and we are a stronger voice on the question how the international financial system needs to be reformed. Debt relief is a big, big issue we engage on.
Thank you. Remy, I will let you have the closing word with regards to the points that Daniela raised, where she's speaking about more cooperation between civil society, but critically, the reform question, right? So if we had to speak about reform, what do you think is the most sustainable, viable, and executable way, gateway, to be able to explore options of reform?
Il y a beaucoup de défiance en ce moment.
There's a lot of suspicion at the moment, distrust, and it's mounting. And I think that we need to push back. These are forces that are trying to divide, create a rift between countries and peoples. I agree entirely with what Gilbert and Mohamed have said. We need to start by meeting people's basic needs. Obviously, that's a major aspiration, and we do that in conventional ways. We invest, but we need to do more. But I'd also like to say that I fully endorse what Daniela has said about how working on the basis of those investments for basic services and needs to move on and to do work that generates a feeling of confidence and respect. And I think also that in each of our countries, from a political point of view, there has to be a bit more harmony. At the French Agency for Development, we've tried to be innovative. I was in Dakar last week to invest in the lead-up to the Youth Olympic Games that will take place in 2026, 2 years after the Paris Olympic Games, and the Senegalese authorities want to make this first Olympic event in Africa since Baron de Coubertin set up the Olympic Games. So it's the first time, whereas one sports person in 3 will be African by 2030. So there's one way of measuring justice or injustice. So as I was saying, the Senegalese authorities want to use these Youth Olympic Games to ensure connection for the whole population, to talk to the youth of the country. It's a very young population, and to give a boost to education, to health and the economy and entrepreneurship. Next week, I'm going to be in Benin. We're going to be investing in a museum there. And the work that was in the museum here in Paris, said that many of the art pieces of art are going to be returned to Benin to be exhibited in this museum. And this is a source, I think, of greater respect, positive dynamic, opening up to civil society, and really fostering development. I think that we have to break out of the usual silos and choose investment decisions that will be really impactful. And that can't just be measured in economic terms, but also has to be measured in terms of our individual and collective capacity to find our place in society, in our own societies, where each and every one of us should be able to work for the society powerfully.
For firstly highlighting the deficiencies in the system and then proposing very concrete solutions as to how we can get out of this crisis. I thank you all for your leadership and for showing up here to challenge us all to do better for the global society. So thank you so much, all of you, and thank you for all of you for joining us for this conversation.